1800 Industrial Revolution. That's what I'm saying. So, yeah, they'll the other stuff in that book. Anybody else? All right, so we are fast approaching it. So I left my attendance sheet in my office because I don't know what I was thinking. So I'm going to pass the sign-in sheet around, and if you would please sign in. And as you do that, let's go ahead and get started. So the last thing that we were talking about in here was legal reform, and specifically common law, presentment juries, those kinds of things that are important to not only English history and establishing that foundation of English common law, but I also mentioned that it's important to our foundation, legal foundation as well. So it's important to kind of know all of those things that are going on. We got through Henry II. We did not get to this guy, this handsome guy, Edward I. So let's go ahead and talk about Edward I, who, by the way, was king, if you want to get his dates down, from 1272 to 1307. 1272 to 1307. He was referred to as Longshanks. It's kind of a weird nickname. But the reason he was called Longshanks is because he was quite tall. Taller than average for that particular period of time. He was a little bit older when he becomes king. He wasn't a young person. So he had been around for a while, kind of knew things that were going on. So he was certainly a very respected person when he becomes king. He was also a very skillful warrior, and just like Henry II, was very interested in law. So there are a couple of things that we attribute to Edward I, and the first is something called statute. Statute. So before Edward I, statute, there we go. Before Edward I, yes, that's right, we had royal edicts, like things that the king would issue, but there was no real formalized process for that. So what Edward I does is to sort of formalize that process. It's a way that the king and his council are going to start creating law. So it's not just a royal edict, it's not just this king saying, hey, I want this to happen. It's an official, formalized way of creating some kind of law that might go into effect and be in effect for a while until it gets changed or whatever the case may be. So it's under Edward I that we see that kind of statutory law go into effect. Interestingly enough, it's also under Edward I that we begin to see the better creation, or more formalized, if you will, creation of what we call Parliament. Oh, that very important advisory body in England. And it makes England different than other European countries, because England has a monarch. They still have a monarch today, although she really doesn't do a whole lot. I don't want to say she doesn't do a whole lot. She actually does a lot. But as far as legal stuff, she doesn't do a whole lot. But England is different, because not only do they have that king, not only do they have that monarch, but they also have this. And over time, Parliament is going to become more and more important, more and more powerful. Today, it's the government of England, for all intents and purposes. So the development of Parliament makes England different, makes England special, and it's kind of interesting. So interestingly enough, Parliament comes about because the king wants to tax the people. And you say, whoa, didn't the king tax the people before? When we talked about the feudal system and we talked about the Doomsday Book on Tuesday, I did mention it as a way to kind of tax, but that's kind of a loose term at that point in time, because he didn't really tax everybody. Because keep in mind that feudal system, so we have the king at the top, and then we have the nobles, and then we have the vassals, and then we have the peasants, right? So he wasn't taxing everybody. What he was doing is requiring his nobles, who were vassals to the king, to pay him money based on whatever property or whatever wealth they had. And in turn, these vassals would be responsible for providing that same kind of tribute to the nobles. Does that make sense? So it wasn't really a tax for everybody, it was a tax for the vassals of the king. Well, that's limited, right? And by the way, we mentioned Tuesday as well that the feudal system breeds this sort of disorganization or this decentralization that the king really didn't want to see. Not only in England, but in other places as well. So if he can only get those tributes from his nobles, assuming they're wealthy nobles, and most of them were, that was okay, because he was going to get a lot of money. But assuming he can only require those nobles to pay him that tribute, that leaves a whole bunch of other people who are not being taxed directly by the king. Does that make sense? So, how do we change that? Well, we change that with Parliament. So King Edward I decides, I want to go to war against Scotland. It ended badly. I'm just going to throw that out there. It ended badly for England. But he wants to go to war with Scotland. Knows he needs money to do that. Like, way more money than he would get just saying to his nobles, hey, pay me a tribute. They're going to give him military service. They have to do that. That's under the feudal system. But he knows he needs a lot of money to go fight Scotland, because it's going to be years that England is involved in a war against Scotland. Okay? So what he decides to do is to create what's called a lay subsidy. A lay subsidy, which is a tax on everyone. And it's a kind of tax that is what we would today call an income tax. Although they didn't really have income like we do today, but it's kind of an income tax because it's based on the wealth of the individual. So if you're a peasant and you don't have any wealth, you don't have any land, you don't have any movable property or anything like that, you're not going to be taxed all that much. But if you're up there and you have vast lands and vast wealth and vast income, then your tax, of course, is going to be much higher. So it's based on the wealth, the property of the person. But everybody gets taxed. Now here's the deal. So if everybody gets taxed, you have to have one, people willing to pay the tax. You don't want to start a revolution because you're taxing everybody. And two, people willing to collect the tax. So if you want to make it more likely that people are going to collect the tax and pay the tax, you have to give people a say in the tax. So if you want to give people a say in the tax, you have to have representatives from different communities saying, okay, we agree to this. That's Parliament. So there were two branches of Parliament that formed. One was composed of the King's Council, those barons, those bishops, those nobles. That was eventually going to become the House of Lords. The House of Lords. But the other group that Edward brings in include the knights. They're not nobles. They don't hold those big titles. The knights, residents of the different communities. And eventually what's going to happen is that they're going to become known as the House of Commons. So we have the House of Lords. This is true today. We have the House of Lords, and we have the House of Commons. And Parliament develops as a way for the king to have those representatives to go to Parliament and say, hey, I want money. Do you agree to this tax? Are you going to sign off on this tax? So one of the biggest powers that Parliament has, even early on, is the ability to levy taxes. The ability to levy taxes. And that provides Parliament, even when it's not as big a part of the government as it is today, that provides Parliament a really big authority, at least within English. The king was still the authority, the ultimate authority, but Parliament, even early on, had the power to do that. England today is not a constitutional monarchy. They don't have an official constitution. What they do have are a series of documents that are important, that provide precedents, legal precedents, that provide boundaries or things that, the king can't do this, or the monarch, I should say, can't do this or can't do this. And that includes the Magna Carta, which comes about in 1215. That includes the English Bill of Rights, 1689. So that includes a number of different things. But they're not a constitutional monarchy, but there are developments over time that are going to give us the English government that exists today. So, Parliament. Any questions about that? All right. So let's talk briefly about some other countries. I use England as a really good example of things going on, changes going on. We're not going to spend as much time on other countries, but they are important to kind of keep in mind. Those developments in some of those countries come a bit later. France, whenever we talk about France, they have a problem with the nobles. They have a problem with the dukes. The dukes, especially of Normandy, Brittany, Burgundy, and Aquitaine. Normandy, Brittany, Burgundy, and Aquitaine, those dukes in particular were, for a good chunk of the early Middle Ages, more powerful than the King of France. They had more money, they had more wealth, they had more influence than the King of France. So when we're talking about France, it is divided into different territories. And the King of France would have been in a place called the Ile de Paris, so Paris, basically. But that doesn't mean that he has control over all of those other regions. He has to work within that structure. And part of that came from Charlemagne. So when we talked about Charlemagne, and that was a long time ago, but when we talked about Charlemagne, he's able to consolidate his empire. But when he dies, what happens?
It breaks apart.
Breaks apart because it goes to whom?
His 4 sons.
Sons, yeah. So when it breaks apart and goes to the 4 sons, that's a kind of decentralization as well, and that's going to plague France for quite some time. That kind of decentralization is going to plague France for quite some time. Eventually, we see France come back together again, but there's always a struggle. There's always a struggle between the King of France and some of those powerful baronies, so those powerful lands. It comes together under Philip II, who ruled from 1180 to 1223. 1180 to 1223. He begins that consolidation of the French kingdom, but it's going to be a really long time, like into the 15th century, this fighting between the king and those very powerful nobles in France to really kind of bring together and consolidate all of France. The Iberian kingdoms, so Spain, basically. Let's talk about Spain. So from the 8th century, the Iberian Peninsula, as it was called, so this territory right in here, was occupied by the Islamic Empire. And so from the 8th century to the latter part of the 15th century, what we're going to see in Spain is a political war. It's a political war for power, for control over those different regions of the Iberian Peninsula, but it's also a religious war as well. Because we see the Spanish Muslims also referred to as Moors. Moors. Fighting against the Christians who live in the Iberian Peninsula. And the Christians are going to call this very long conflict. It's not like a war that is continuous, but it's this very long conflict between those two groups in the Iberian Peninsula, again from the 8th century, basically the 15th. They call that the Reconquest, so the Spanish Reconquest. And eventually, late 15th century, that reconquest is going to happen, but it takes that long. It takes that long a time, the conflict between these two groups, political and religious, to really bring about the consolidation of Spain. Questions about that?
You said it was the Moors against the Christians?
Right, so the Spanish Muslims, or the Moors, as they were referred to at the time, against the Christians. That. Yes.
Oh.
Oops, let me go back.
Is that the same thing, or is that different from the Spanish Inquisition?
So the Spanish Inquisition, what I would say is that it happened concurrently. So one of the things that you're going to see, and this isn't just in Spain, and it isn't just tied to the Reconquest, but it is part of that Reconquest, finding the heretics.
So the Inquisition was more of the religious part of
Right.
okay.
Yeah. So it certainly functioned at the same time, and it's going to be part of that Reconquest where you see people who are not only Moors, but also eventually when we get to the Protestant Reformation, that was 16th century, but you see the Inquisition into the 16th century, then they're going to start persecuting Protestants. But it's happening at the same time, so it's that religious aspect.
Did it happen to, like, they were looking for the Moors and then the Protestants? What about, like, Jews?
Sure, so any religious group that's not Christian. And there was a lot of anti-Semitism at that point in time. Unfortunately, there's a lot of anti-Semitism through that point in time up to the 20th century. So we certainly see persecution, religious persecution of Jews as well. But at least during the Reconquest, it was more of a focus on, especially in areas, especially in territories where the Christians are going to capture those territories politically from the Moors. It kind of depended on how they're going to deal with the Moorish population in those groups. Some of those areas, they just taxed the individuals. And they were taxed, but they could live, and then some of the areas, it was a bit more extreme. Any other questions? All right. Holy Roman Empire. It's always interesting to talk about the Holy Roman Empire because very famously, not holy, not Roman, an empire. And it really kind of plays a role, at least politically, when we consider other countries. Eventually, when Spain consolidates, the Spanish kings will be Holy Roman emperors, and that will give them a lot of power and authority. There are political power plays between the Holy Roman Empire, Spain, France, England, Italy, although Italy's not consolidated for a long time, so papal, the Holy Father, the Pope, so there are political power plays between all of those entities, and the Holy Roman Empire gets caught up in the middle of that. And so the Holy Roman Empire technically has an emperor. That person is hereditary and could be a king in another country. That was perfectly okay. But it's broken into all of these different states, and there were many of those states. And each one of those states has a principality, has a prince. So there were princes who were sovereign in those principalities, but it was all consolidated under the Holy Roman Emperor, right? Does that make sense? And if you're confused, good, because that is the Holy Roman Empire. Confusing, right? So the Holy Roman Empire, at least in the medieval times, there was an effort by a couple of those princes called the Hohenstaufens, German princes, whose Holy Roman Empire basically sits in what would become Germany. So the Hohenstaufens, write this down. All right, here I saw this. There we go. Okay, so the Hohenstaufens. Frederick I and Frederick II. Friedrich I, Friedrich II. So both of these guys wanted control over northern Italy, and they're actually going to move a force against it. They wanted northern Italian independence. They wanted to sort of bring it into the Holy Roman Emperor fold. The Pope did not want to see that because it would mean that they would be, here are the papal states. So if you're, I know it's difficult to read, you can't read that. But here are the papal states. Here's where we're talking about northern Italy. And of course, here's the Holy Roman Empire. So the Pope says, no, that's way too close to the States. I don't want you butting into our territory. So what happens is there's a fight between those two groups. And while those two princes, Frederick I and Frederick II, are engaged in fighting in northern Italy, they're leaving their principalities basically unmanned. That provides the Pope the opportunity to focus efforts on the Holy Roman Empire and to gain, at least at that point in time, more authority over the Holy Roman Empire. And I tell you that because it's a really good example of the power plays that we're going to see in that particular region. Because the Holy Roman Empire was split into so many different principalities, it's not ever going to breed that push for consolidation. It's very difficult to consolidate all of those principalities. Eventually Germany does consolidate, that's not until the 1870s, 1870 to be exact. So it's going to take a really long time to get that kind of consolidation, and in large part it's because there were so many different groups, and other countries are going to see the Holy Roman Empire as sort of this region to extend their power, not only in their own countries, but also over the Pope. Because one of the things to keep in mind is that the church is not separate from these governments. And the Pope is just as political at this point in time as the King of France, the King of England, the King of Spain. So it's important to kind of keep that in mind. All right. Christianity in medieval Europe. So what are some changes that we're seeing in Christianity? Well, one of the things that we see, and I kind of just mentioned it with the power plays in the Holy Roman Empire. So one of the things that we see is that the Pope is trying to take more control over those political entities, over those kings, to make sure that the kings don't become so powerful that they challenge his authority. So there are a couple of ways that this happens. One is through what's called the investiture controversy. The investiture controversy. So what is an investiture? Well, before a certain period of time, what kings were doing is making what are called lay investitures. Lay investitures. Meaning, if there was a religious office open in their country, they would nominate a person to hold that office. So if it was like a bishop or whatever, they would say, hey, we want this person to be the next bishop. That had been happening for a really long time, until a guy named Pope Gregory VII. Pope Gregory VII, who was Pope between 1073 and 1085. 1073 and 1085. Gregory the seventh says, no, I don't want that to happen. I don't want that to happen because that gives the king the ability to put his own men in these religious offices. And this is a religious office, not a secular office, so shouldn't it be the purview of the Pope? Shouldn't the Pope have the ability to do this? And so he says, no more lay investitures. And that starts the investiture controversy because there are kings who say, no, we don't want to see that, because that would take a power away from them. So there was this fight between these two groups. Finally, they come to a decision and something called the Concordat of Worms. The Concordat of Worms. Basically, and the Pope, by the way, the Concordat of Worms, this was in 1122. It takes them that long to come to a decision. It takes a while. 1122. The Pope at that point in time was a guy named Calixtus II. Calixtus II. Roman numeral. So the Concordat of Worms says that the bishop would be elected by the church. So if there's an office of bishop open, then the church would choose that person. and they would provide the spiritual investiture. But when they provide the spiritual investiture, the king or the prince or whomever was in charge would provide the secular or temporal investiture. And if you're like, hey, that's splitting hairs, yeah, but that's what they do. So the Pope would be in charge of the spiritual investiture, but the king or the prince or whomever would be in charge of the temporal investiture, the temporal office. So basically they both had a say. Pope more so than king, but they both had a say. The other interesting thing that one of the popes does, a guy named Innocent III, Pope Innocent III, he is going to decide, hey, I want to use something that I can make sure the kings aren't acting against the Pope or the church in some way. And so he comes up with the idea of what's called the interdict. If a pope issues an interdict on a certain country, like Germany or France or whatever, basically that means that no priest, bishop, archbishop, whomever can give the sacraments to anybody within that country. And the reason that they would do that is to put political pressure on the ruler of that country. So if the king does something that the pope doesn't agree with, and the king says, forget you, pope, because I'm the king and I can do whatever I want, the pope can enter or put together what's called the interdict and say, hey, within your country, no priest is going to give the last rites or anything, or marry people or whatever, or any of those important things that priests have to do. And the people, the idea is that the people in that territory or that state would become so upset they would put political pressure on the king to change his mind. And we see this in force. So there was a French king named Philip Augustus who wanted his marriage annulled, didn't like his wife. And the Pope says, no, I'm not going to annul your marriage. And he says, well, I'm going to turn her around. I'm going to annul my own marriage and marry somebody else. And the Pope issues an interdict on France. And the king says, well, okay. So it's a pretty powerful thing that can happen. Yes?
What was the name of the pope that came up with the late investigation?
Innocent the Third.
Innocent.
Innocent the Third.
And what were those dates again?
For Innocent the Third, I don't think I gave you dates.
It was the first pope that you mentioned, I think, that came up with the lay invested, or got rid of the lay invested.
Calixtus, that was in 1122. Calixtus the Second was 1122.
Okay, so that pope was Innocent.
So the interdict was Innocent the Third.
No, the pope right before it.
That was for the lay investiture?
Yeah.
That, you want the dates on that one?
Yeah,
So
and
Gregory the Seventh from
Gregory the
1073 to 1085. 1073 to 1085.
and it was Gregory the
7. And whenever I mention popes, there are a lot of them. Know the ones that I mentioned, but you don't have necessarily the dates on that, unless I spent like Concordat of Worms 1122.
Okay.
Not necessarily popes. That's great. All right, so what else do we see? Well, we see some new monastic orders come about. And they're kind of interesting. So one of the first groups that we see develop is something called the Cistercians. The Cistercians. Write that up for you. So the Cistercians are known for being a very strict order. They don't eat a lot. They have one robe, and they wear it until it basically falls off. They work a lot. The idea is that they do not remain idle. They have fewer religious services than some of the other monastic orders that we see. We also see the Franciscan order develop as well, the Franciscan monks. They are going to be known for working more with the people. They're going to be known for working more with the people. They believed that it was important to go out and help the community, and so they're going to be seen a bit more often than some of the other monastic orders that tended to stay kind of cloistered.
What's the difference between a priest and a friar?
That's a good question. So, anybody know?
Isn't a friar like, it's like the prerequisite before a priest?
Yeah, it's lower down on the chain, but I don't quite. So the priest would be the church service.
The friar was the sort of basically he would get everything. He would ready all the ceremonies. The priest would.
Is that still the case in the Catholic Church?
This was just history. And so, but the cool thing was priests were celibate, friars weren't. And so when friars, if they did that and they went over, they were actually looked down upon.
Oh, I got you.
Celibate. It's like a whole different level.
So I knew that there could be, potentially there can be priests who have families, but only after, so if like the wife died and they became widowed, they could go into the priesthood. They still had a family, so of course they hadn't taken that vow of celibacy from the beginning. But there was a way for them to do that, but they're called something different. So in the Catholic Church, and this is true even today, in the Catholic Church, it's some kind of, they can function as priests, but it's something different. So did you catch that? What were you gonna say, Tori?
Oh, I was gonna say, like, to my knowledge, aren't friars viewed more as, like, brothers in terms of, like, they're not quite like the father of the church, like,
Right.
it's not like, oh, Holy Father, it's, like, more of, like, an assistant-ish, like,
Yeah, they're definitely lower down on the food chain.
yeah.
Okay,
Popes could have
so it's basically-
even popes had families, though, like, they were kept kind of secret, but.
Yeah, well,
The
some
Borgias.
more secret than others. They weren't supposed to. And that's one of the interesting things, and when we get to the Renaissance, we'll kind of talk about that. But that's one of the other interesting things about popes. Not only were they ultra political, today they're seen as religious figures. They are political, but not like this, not like the popes were earlier on. But they weren't necessarily sticking to the required elements of being pope. So yeah, like the Borgias are a really good
I forget
example.
which pope,
Before that point,
yeah, which
that.
pope, like, Borgia actually was, like, I don't know his actual, like, pope name, but he supposedly was, like, the father of his own grandchild, so. It's not
Yeah,
exactly
that was-
popish.
and what I would say, there are scholars, religious scholars today who suggest that that was actually propaganda against him because he was a Spanish pope, so he was seen as the outsider pope coming in. Whether he actually fathered his own grandchild or whatever the case may be. They see that as potential propaganda against him just because he was an outsider and not liked a whole lot. Because not only did he openly have a family and made his son a cardinal at some
Openly
point,
bought the big-
openly got the papacy, but he did some other things too, went to war, all those kinds of things that made people mad. So yeah, but yeah, did he do things that weren't popish? Yeah, absolutely. So you can get him on that. What were you gonna say, Joey?
Oh, it's kind of like the opposite of a monk, but the same rank. You know how a pope is called father, friar
Right.
would be called brother.
Yes. Yeah.
So it's like the very first rank you get upon going into the clergy.
Did you look it up?
I did.
Okay, perfect. All right. Any other questions? Okay. All right, so let's talk about the Dominicans. They're another group. And by the way, when we're talking about the Inquisition, they're the guys. They're the guys. So the Dominicans wanted to prevent heresy. That was the big reason, or one of the big pushes, rather, in that monastic order. They wanted to return to official church doctrines. They were very strict readers of church doctrine, like there weren't any gray areas, there wasn't any wiggle room. And if you weren't operating within those strict parameters, then you could potentially be accused of heresy. And by the way, when we're talking about heresy, that's a pretty big crime at the time. So heresy was not only considered a crime against God, but it was also considered a crime against humanity. It's a big deal. And those who were charged with heresy faced the death penalty. And we see I say death penalty, it's a bit more gruesome than that. We're talking burning at the stake, that kind of person. So it was a pretty big deal to be charged with heresy. So if you spoke out against the church, if you questioned the church's teachings, if you practiced other religious faiths in Catholic regions of the world, then you could potentially be charged with heresy. So it's a big deal. And the Dominicans were those individuals who were very much involved in those inquisitions. Okay, any questions about that? All right, so since we're bumping up towards finals, let's talk about how medieval universities functioned. That's always interesting. So medieval university, anybody know where the first medieval university was? Actually the first college created, at least in Europe. It's Bologna. The first college was in Bologna, but by the end of the Middle Ages, there were 80 different colleges across Europe, 80 different universities across Europe, including Oxford in England. So Oxford is one of the earliest, it's not the earliest, it's in Europe. If you went to one of these universities, first of all, you were male. So that's a given. But you also received a liberal arts curriculum that included an emphasis on grammar. Everybody's favorite thing, right? Rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. Go over that list again. Grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. And because we didn't have a printing press at this point in time, printing press does not come out until the mid part of the 15th century. Books were rare. We talked about that. Monks copying those books, painstakingly hand copying those books. If you're doing that to create a book, obviously it takes many, many man-hours to do that. It's going to be a very rare and expensive thing. So not everybody had those books. And so basically what would happen is that the professor would be before the class reading the book, and you would be absorbing that information.
What is a logic class? What is?
Oh, we actually still teach it. Because it's still important. It's still important to be logical. So it is a way, it's actually part of the philosophy department, yeah. So it's a way of figuring out arguments. And if you get into formal logic, then you can break down an argument using P's and Q's. So it kind of relates to math a little bit, too. And I'm doing a terrible job of explaining that. Go take a logic class. We can do that.
I don't want to anymore.
My husband teaches logic. So he would be like, what are you doing? You're not explaining it right. And I'm not. But it's hard to explain. But it's a way of thinking about arguments and finding fallacies and recognizing informal arguments and formal arguments and all of those kinds of things. So the different parts of the argument. To make you not only a better critical thinker, but a better debater.
I was going to say, is it kind of like debating?
Yes, but you don't debate.
It's what?
I should text him. I should be like, hey, explain logic.
You're just analyzing an argument. You're not debating it.
You're not debating anything. You're just taking the argument and figuring out, okay, what's the valid part of this argument? What's the invalid part of this argument? Based on formal logic rules. So it's almost like applying like an algebraic theorem. It's like applying a logical theorem to that argument to figure out the strengths and weaknesses.
It's kind of like a personal debate.
Sure.
It was like an entire section in ethics. And
Did he do
it
that?
was the worst 2 weeks of my life.
Some people like it a lot and do really, really well with it, and some people are like, I have no idea what's going on. Yes.
It's gonna sound like really bad, but what's the purpose of that?
So the purpose of that, and this is true for anybody, so it's a way of critically thinking about information. So you're not taking anything at face value, and this is why it's part of philosophy. You're not taking anything at face value, you're critically analyzing it for problems, truths, invalid argument, those kinds of things, so that you can potentially apply that to all of life. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
So it's a way of being, thinking logic.
Are they the one that, whenever politicians are arguing between each other, just like some kind of people in the back looking at it and reading on it?
Informally.
Okay.
Yeah, so
rather than
they're
one having
basically
the-
doing that, but they're more truth checkers. They're basically more, hey, are you telling me the truth or not telling me the truth? They're not really analyzing the arguments and saying,
Right.
this part is an informal fallacy and this part is strong, whatever.
Well, mine's more of an example to kind of help understand. So, like logic, you take a sentence, say, Lord Farquaad is a bad person.
Yes.
Therefore, or Lord Farquaad is a bad noble. Therefore, all nobles are bad people.
Yes, that is a good example. Or penguins are birds, therefore all birds are penguins.
Yes.
Obviously, that's not true. But you have to figure out, so you can apply those rules to different arguments or different things that you come across in life. Yeah. So, there is valid, it is, importance to it, but I'm just not explaining. He's gonna die. Like, please give me a paragraph how to explain the value of your class.
Does he teach here?
He teaches you. He does. Same name, well, last name.
Whoa! Interesting.
I don't know what. All right, so that's the liberal arts curriculum. So they would literally read the book because nobody else had access to the book, so they would be reading the book. So I like to think that my economics professor in college was a medieval college professor because that's what he did. It's really boring, and I hated him, and we all felt the same.
How did you really feel?
He was bad. He was really bad. Anyway, so that's what happened. And then at the end of that 4 years, so it been about 4 years. At the end of that 4 years, you didn't have any exams, you didn't have any papers to write. That sounds all great, right? Oh, but it's the bad part coming. So at the end of that 4 years, basically what would happen, you would go before all of your professors and they would quiz you. They would ask you very pointed questions. It was an oral examination, and if you answered those correctly, you passed and you got your degree, and if not, you failed, and that was it. So just keep that in mind as you're studying for problems. It could be worse. They could be oral examinations, or you get grilled 4 hours at a time. So let's say you wanted to become a doctor of philosophy, hence that liberal arts curriculum. So what you would do is to study for another 10 years on average, and you would study more intently all of those subjects that I just talked about, but also focus on specific areas. So if you wanted to focus on logic or philosophy or whatever, you would focus on the specific areas, and then at the end of that 10-year period of time, another oral examination, because we didn't have tests or papers or anything like that, and you would be grilled over the last 10 years of information that you learned.
Oh, wow.
And then you could become a PhD. So it can be worse. It can be worse. But at the same time, you kind of had to know that stuff, right? So these are pretty educated people.
How many
You gotta have
people
to know it.
passed?
Well, there weren't a whole lot of people who went to university anyway.
Was it just one guy asking you a bunch of questions because everybody else failed?
No, it was actually all of your professors. So depending on, it would be the professors of whatever. So if you were focusing on rhetoric, it would be those professors who taught that subject. Does that make sense? So it would be that group. And there were people who passed. I mean, there are people who are going to study those things and take those seriously. But it would be a very small group anyway, because for you to attend university, you not only had to be male, you also had to be wealthy enough to pay for all of that schooling. And most people were not wealthy enough to do that. So it was a fairly small group. But yeah, I mean, if you take the time to do that, I mean, it isn't impossible.
They didn't have all the distractions back then either that we have now.
That's true. They
so.
did not have smartphones. Looking at it. And what I will say is that if you go on for an advanced degree, they still have that oral examination process in there. I did have to go before my professors. There's still that oral exam that you'll have to do. So that doesn't go. And quite frankly, if you can talk about something, you have to know it to talk about it. You have to know it to explain it. Obviously, I don't know logic all that much.
You could argue that doesn't happen a lot nowadays.
Well, but that's the best indicator. If you can talk about something, if you kind of explain it out, then it means you have a better grasp of that information. I always tell students to do that on your own when you're studying any information, not just history. But talk to yourself. Like pretend you're, explain it to your dog, or cat, or bird, or fish, or whatever. Explain it to them, because if you can explain it to somebody, if you can explain it to them, then you know that information. If you can't, then that's information that you need to go. What are you going to say, Mary?
I was just gonna say it helps if you actually like the subject that you're doing.
Well, that's true.
Because if
But
you like
if
the
you're-
subject, then you're bound to actually remember.
Sure,
Just the
and
text.
if you're spending 10 years of your life
Yeah,
on that
true.
particular
Yeah.
subject, you probably like it. Or maybe not, maybe by the end of that, you're like, I don't want to ever do logic. All right, so the other thing that we see with medieval universities, they're focusing more on something that's called scholasticism. So this was an effort at this point in time during the Middle Ages to bridge the divide that seemed to exist between faith and worldly truths or reason. Because some people said, oh, well, if you question everything, then you're questioning the church and you're questioning God, and it's a conspiracy. And so there was this effort to sort of bridge the divide. And one of the guys who contributes to scholasticism is this guy named Thomas Aquinas, St. Thomas Aquinas, who during his life wrote something called the Summa Theologica. The Summa Theologica. So in the Summa Theologica, basically what Thomas Aquinas said is that, okay, well, when you're talking about worldly stuff, it's okay not to use faith. It's okay not to use faith to sort of describe that. But if you're talking about spiritual stuff, you have to use faith. So he said, there can be a divide. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're not religious or that you're being heretical if you're talking about worldly stuff and analyzing, observing life and observing the stars or planets or whatever. But if you're talking about spiritual stuff, then you need to bring God into that. So it was a way for him to sort of bridge that divide, if you will. But it was always a concern. It was always a concern about questioning and how far one could go in doing that. It was always a concern to church leaders, to the Pope. Would people begin to question the church or church teachings? And eventually they do, right? Protestant Reformation. Yes.
What was the name of the guy again?
Thomas Aquinas. You're welcome. Yes.
What was the original critical reception of Thomas Aquinas among the church and the common people?
So he becomes a saint.
Right.
So it's good because he's not questioning God, and he's trying to say, "Hey, the church is important." So he's eventually going to, it's going to work out for him, yeah. Because he's not saying, "Don't use faith; faith's not important." Does that make sense?
Mhm.
You don't know
way, like Enlightenment people were still kind of using that. It's what you can, worldly things are what you can see, like, that is this.
Yeah.
So I can describe it with like, spiritual things. Well, as we advance in science, like, we could see more about the world, and therefore, we could describe more of it without calling into, like, faith.
Yeah, and like I said, it's going to be that constant struggle through the Protestant Reformation, because there are going to be some people who get in trouble because the church sees that they've gone too far. There's a famous book, I think it's called The Cheese and the Worms. I think it's just simply called The Cheese and the Worms. But let me double check on that. But it's this famous book about this group within France, this group of individuals in this community in France, gets charged with heresy. Are you going to look it up? Cheese and the Worms. So gets charged with heresy, and they're not like, they're just everyday individuals living in France, everyday farmers living in France. But they get charged with heresy because one guy gets questioned, and he says, they say, okay, well, how do you believe in God? Well, yes. Well, but when he describes it as the cheese and the worms. And the church says, no, that's not the official church teachings. That's you're thinking beyond that. So there was always this fuzzy line between what people could say, what they could claim. If they went too far and it was seen as questioning God or questioning the church, then that would be considered heresy. But if it's within those parameters, like the church is still important and we're not questioning the church and God's still important, we're not questioning God, then it was okay. Is it the cheese and the worms?
It's the cheese and the worms, the cosmos of, and it won't let me like figure it.
Okay, so I was wrong. Cheese and worms. So it's this interesting book.
But it says it's about Italy.
Oh, is it Italy? Sorry, not Greece. Same thing. Still people, different places. Oh, I'm thinking of Montelou, which is in France. Sorry.
It's by Carlo Ginzburg.
So I'm thinking of Montelou, which is in France, which is another book. But that one's a good one too. Alrighty. Any questions about that? Okay, so I'm going to stop there. We'll talk about the 100 Years' War. We'll get there on Tuesday, but I'm going to stop there to pass out this stuff that I want to pass out to you. So actually, I have a couple of things. Let me go ahead and explain this before I get this to you. And by the way, when you work on these, we might not finish, so go ahead and keep these and bring them back on Tuesday, and we'll finish on Tuesday. There are several questions that I want you to answer. Some of the questions are questions that I've come up with, and some of the questions relate